Good evening, everyone, and thank you for watching NBC6 Voices on our Facebook and YouTube pages. I'm Jawan Strader. Well, a crisis in Cuba. People on the island crying for help after lack of food, access to proper medical care, and an economic spiral is causing people to die at alarming rates. They're tired of the communist regime that is still in place after more than 60 years. Cuban exiles and allies have joined in solidarity here in South Florida and across the nation, demanding help for the island nation. Over a week ago, thousands took to the streets calling for action and international aid for Cuban nationals. So please welcome with me today is Kika Araujo. She is joining me now, and Kika is an Afro-Cuban and Black American who has relatives still living in Cuba. Kika, first of all, welcome to the show this evening. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You got it. Well, Kika, first and foremost, how's your family doing on the island?
They're okay for the circumstances. My uncle was diagnosed with COVID, and this is after 3 vaccinations. Last time I talked to him, he was in the hospital, but they were releasing him. So hopefully he's recovering.
And I want to know about your thoughts on everything that's going on. The Cuban regime, the Castro regime, the communist regime that's still in place. Yeah. For all those folks who may not understand what's going on, talk about that and talk about why so many people are fed up.
Well, the 62 years that Castro has been in power is really a smaller piece in the bigger story. So right now we're dealing with 62 years of people being oppressed, people not having resources, right? And the talking points from Miami Cubans who exiled when Castro left, that is the talking point that they use. Well, honestly speaking, oppression, discrimination and brutality has been in effect for 508 years for the Black Cubans who've never left the island. So we're dealing with 2 very different things. And I believe that it's disingenuous and also disappointing to erase that crucial part of this. There's erasure when we only talk about 62 years. So in essence, we're saying 62 years of being oppressed, 62 years of brutality and a regime that doesn't listen to the people, when that's always been the case for Black Cubans anyway, for 508 years since 1513, since the first African landed on Cuba. So if we're going to address the situation properly, and we are asking for equity and freedom from everybody, for everybody, we have to include that history as well.
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit. So there are a number of Black Cubans here in South Florida and just over 1 million living in Cuba. So are those who are of darker complexions facing a greater danger while living in Cuba at this time?
Always have been. Absolutely. Absolutely. It was actually those voices that are most in danger. Black Cubans are more likely to be detained in prison or more likely to be killed. We don't get the benefit, or they don't get the benefit of having a question asked first, or somebody knocking in the door and just roughing you up. You might just be killed as soon as someone opens the door.
Wow. And I want to ask you, do a lot of people, do you believe, are uneducated, not only, or what I say, ignorant, okay? Are ignorant to the fact that there are a lot of Black Cubans on the island in Cuba, maybe don't even realize that there are Black Cubans on the island?
Well, it's about representation. So when we look at the media, when we look at Univision, when we look at Telemundo, and we see Cuban people, they are almost always white. Cuba is a Black nation. Nobody ever wants to admit that, but Cuba is a Black nation. If you go to Cuba, they look just like me and you. You walk through Centro Havana, Cerro, Matanzas, Santiago, they look just like me and you.
I know, I was shocked. So I went there to Cuba. I was there in Havana. I was there to cover President Obama. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked when I arrived there on the island to see so many Black Cubans. I was shocked. And there were some things that I saw that I wasn't ready for. And it was an educational experience. And some of the things that I saw, even that they were selling in some of the shops there that depicted Black people. And I was just, it was an eye-opening experience for me in itself. And so it's interesting that you should talk about that. You should talk about the history, because I didn't know that history until you just said it. And you just talked about some of the history there that I didn't know. So I want to know from you your thoughts on that statement that came out from Black Lives Matter. Okay, so it definitely touched a nerve. Here's the statement here. It was on Twitter. It never mentioned the communist regime. Instead, that statement, what it did, it blamed the United States and the embargo, which of course many Cubans on the island called the blockade. And I wanted to know your thoughts on when you first read that statement from Black Lives Matter.
When I first read it, I was like, what the hell? I literally said, what the hell? And then I had to read it for what it was, right? So it's not Black Lives Matter as a whole. There's this idea that Black Americans have that when Castro took over Cuba in 1959, that Black Cubans were free and they had liberties and they had all of these things that they didn't have prior to Castro, meaning when Batista was in power, right? And they're not wrong in that sense. However, with that being said, Black Cubans did have the right to become educated. They had more than what they had. So we romanticize having more than what we had, but we were never equal. And that is what I think Black Lives Matter at the top, when they made that statement, that's the sentiment that they had. Now we can blame the imperialist United States all day, because yes, the embargo does have an impact on what's going on with Cubans now. It does. But also, let's not paint Fidel Castro or Che Guevara like they were not racist.
Exactly.
They wanted to, they challenged the establishment until they became the establishment. So it was never about equity for Black people. They just needed people, they needed bodies to get what they needed done. And that's what they did.
Oh, that's exactly what they did. And a lot of people, I don't think, are educated on Che, and they think that he's a revolutionary, and they think that that's, of course, revolution. Hey, good. That's a good thing. That means change.
Yeah.
And people don't realize that, Che was racist, against the Black people. And so it's important to understand that and know the history, and to speak to people like yourself and other Cuban Americans to understand exactly what is going on the island, as well as the history. So with that said, since we were talking about Black Lives Matter, I want to bring into our conversation Jasmine and Jasmine Rogers. Jasmine is a part of Black Lives Matter Alliance group here in South Florida. First and foremost, Jasmine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel like Kika's already shut us down. Like there's nothing else to be said. We're done here.
Everybody needs to hear what we got to say. We family.
That's right. That's right. So Jasmine, you are a Black Lives Matter Alliance, a group here in South Florida. So a lot of people, of course, are like, oh man, Black Lives Matter. What the hell are you thinking by putting out a statement that is tone deaf? So, of course, people are going to come to you. They're like, okay, what's going on? So I want to know your thoughts on that statement and your thoughts on what is going on in Cuba.
Yeah, so I think that Black Lives Matter has created a moment for us to understand the organization and to understand Black Lives Matter as a movement, as a phrase, as a rallying cry, right? So I think it's important for everyone who says Black Lives Matter, that doesn't necessarily mean you affiliate with the organization as itself. You just believe that Black Lives Matter, period, right? Point blank, period, as a sentence. And what I think is the perfect way to start this conversation is also by acknowledging that non-Black people need to be very careful with how they critique Black people. Whether or not you agree with them, I have seen way too many critiques of that statement that are rooted in racism and violence. Patrisse Cullors posts on Instagram the threat she's getting in her inbox because of the statement. So that's never about Black Lives Mattering in the first place for these people that are saying I supported your movement until, right? So I think that the state, two things can be true, right? That statement should have gone a little bit further, to Kika's point about how we can't just talk about the embargo, but that does not mean that what's in the statement is not also true, right? I think that we need to acknowledge that in visions for a free Cuba, it does not include a US embargo. For the Cuban people to be able to thrive and live their best lives, it does not include a US embargo. It also does not include the current government that is repressing its people. And I think that there's plenty of commentary all over the internet about those two different things. It's like they're both going hand in hand, right? So we can't talk about one without talking about the other. And when you talk about Cuba and what's happening there, I find it so interesting how many folks here on this land in the United States are willing to jump into somebody else's business to provide reprieve from police violence, reprieve from no internet and things like that, when we can't even handle the things that were happening here. So what does it look like to empower Cuban people on the island to their self-determination, to provide them the support that they need to be free from this dictatorship, while also looking at our own house and being like, oh, we got police violence right here. We got people without internet right here. We have people that are starving in the streets with no place to go right here and right now. So how do we not turn a blind eye to everything that's festering in our house in favor of whiteness and white supremacy? Is what I think it is, because the people that are raising their voices the most here in Florida are these white Cubans with their call for military intervention, which makes no sense.
And so what I want to know is, Kika, your thoughts on, I'm sorry, what Jasmine just said.
Jasmine, I can put it better myself. So this is that disingenuousness that I talk about. So when you talk about going to Cuba and freeing the people, you are literally holding on to what was taken from you when 1 million of you left Cuba, came here to Miami, and started Havana all over again. The white elite, white power, blocking resources from other people, including Black Cubans. So when I hear so many Miami Cubans, and when I speak of Miami Cubans, I'm really speaking not Marielitos, not Balseros. I'm really talking about that group that left and came to Miami between 1959 and 1965. They lobbied in the 80s under Ronald Reagan's administration to sanction Cuba. Understand this. Any sanction, any embargo that has ever been against Cuba has never affected the Cuban government. The Cuban Fidel Castro rocked Adidas, Gucci, Dolce & Gabbana. He ate meat. He ate whatever he wanted. And the only people that suffered with the embargo were the people. So these talking points, and Marco Rubio's coming in with his 2 cents, and the mayor of Miami talking about we should bomb Cuba. If you bomb Cuba, who exactly are you bombing? Because you don't have the range to get to Diaz-Canel. You don't have the range to get to him. So anybody you be bombing would look like me. You would just obliterate the streets of Cuba with regular people. Shut up.
So Jasmine, I want to ask you this because, and Kika, I want her to respond to this as well. So when local protests to support Black Lives Matter, when they were happening, when they were taking place here in South Florida, there were people of all races, ethnic backgrounds, joining in solidarity and support. We saw them marching the streets, standing up, shouting Black Lives Matter, and their support for Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter Alliance here. So I got to ask you, Jasmine, I don't see that right now in the streets that I'm seeing the protests going on, for Cuba, for a free Cuba. So I want to know, Jasmine, why? Why am I not seeing the Black Lives Matter Alliance, even locally out there in the streets, taking part for those people of color that are in Cuba, that are still shouting for a free Cuba?
So I think, Juwan, it's multiple things, right? I think it's a lot of things that I've seen Black folks process, specifically in South Florida, in these moments. I think one thing that's at the forefront of everybody's mind is HB1. right? This bill that our governor just signed not that long ago that made it illegal for folks to block highways. It effectively made it very, very hard to protest without being arrested and charged with felonies and all types of other things. So I know that one of the first things I saw as people were going onto the highway, it was like a quick head spin, like, wait a minute. The governor just said out of his mouth very directly that we will not have this. And then I watched a press conference where Governor DeSantis said, well, those two things are fundamentally different, right? The protests last year were about this other thing and people were burning stuff down. Not here in Florida, he said, but this is about something different. The people are rising up against their government. They're dissatisfied and things like that. Like there's a lot of blatant white supremacy in what's happening. I also think that there is no mistake about the Cuban folks in South Florida that have power and access to resources. And I am all for the freedom of Cuban folks on the island, and I will not march next to a Trump flag or a Blue Lives Matter flag. And the fact that every single picture of a protest that I've seen thus far around the state of Florida, there's a few Trump flags there. There's a few Blue Lives Matter flags there, right? So it's like, in the grand scheme of liberation, when we talk about the people on this land and global liberation, we're not fighting for the same things, it feels like. If you could be in the street with a Trump flag and Matter flag, if you can be posing with police officers, like we're not in this station. And I think that, I know for me personally,
All right, Jasmine, you're breaking up. You're breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
There you
no.
go. There you go.
Did I freeze?
No. You were breaking up there for a minute. You're getting interesting here. So, okay, go ahead. I got you.
I say I'm waiting for Cuban folks in this moment right now to call out the white supremacy and the hypocrisy of our governor. While you all are allowed the space and the freedom to take the streets, ask him to repeal HB1. Ask him to remove the demand as a part of your demands for Florida while everyone is listening to you. Highlight the hypocrisy of what is going on in these moments and the people that are being listened to here. Our protests are looked at very differently, right? The level of protection that we get or not get. I was at the protest in Fort Lauderdale. I organized the protest in Fort Lauderdale last year where they tear gassed the protest after pushing someone over in the street and then started firing rubber bullets. And this was when the protest was over. And here we have folks taking over major highways all across the state with a very, very different response. So I know for me personally, that makes me tired. Not tired enough to do nothing. I'm still, from where I can, doing what I can, but I'm also just very, very tired of the hypocrisy and the white supremacy that's blatant in our face.
Okay, I'm interested in what Kiki has to say about this. Kiki, do you understand where she's coming from, or would you like to see the same support from Black Lives Matter that some definitely Cuban Americans, because I know they were out there in the streets too with Black Lives Matter, walking the streets and protesting last year. So I want to know your thoughts on what Jasmine just said.
So to the latter part of what she said, my sister is optimistic about asking people who are white supremacists in their homelands to give a damn about people they were oppressing over there who look like us here. That's super optimistic. It won't ever happen. I don't expect it. I wouldn't even ask. That's just me. Now, going to the other point, we did see a lot of people come together during Black Lives Matter protests.
Yes.
And so in 1969, the Young Patriots, the Black Panthers, and the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican or Latino movement, a white grassroots movement, and of course the Black Panthers all came together to create a movement that basically was anti-racist, anti-classist, and anti-establishment. We can have that movement again if we put aside, for lack of a better way to put it, we put aside our racial differences, right? And I'm saying, as a person who centers Blackness, I deal with other people on an as-needed basis. I'm saying that knowing full well that I'm this way. The beauty about that movement was they put aside every difference that they had to crack at the elites. I have not seen too many people willing to do that. What I saw was poor white people spewing Trump and hatred when rich white people use you and throw you away. And then you're crying on TV because you don't have insurance, or you're dying from cancer and you expected Trump to come save you. Well, that's what happened when you believe that rich white people care about you. Rich white people only care about rich white people. So it would behoove poor people, no matter the color, to come together to combat racism, classism, education, discrimination. It would behoove us to all come together. But I mean, I preach it to the choir. I don't really feel like people in America are ready for that conversation, but that's just me.
Well, I love hearing ideas and the conversation, and that's something that we're having. So your final thoughts, Kika, and then Jasmine, your final thoughts. Your final thoughts, Kika, before we move on. I just want to know your final thoughts on freedom for Cuba.
My final thoughts for freedom for Cuba. Freedom has to be equitable. So if we're really talking about freedom for Cuba, you have to start with the people who have been oppressed for 508 years. If you are not starting there, then Cuba will never be free.
Very well said. And Jasmine, I know you're coming from the Black Lives Matter Alliance, but I wanted to know your final thoughts as well.
I think if we look at so many of the international crises that have happened over the past couple months that have made it to our TV screens here in Florida, the U.S. has had some type of hand in all of them. I think that for people in those countries who know best how to self-determine what their freedom looks like, we do need to have a conversation about what the lack of U.S. intervention needs to look like, while also holding those governments accountable. I also think that in moments like this, it is our responsibility to listen to people that are in these places that are the most marginalized. So that is talking to Afro-Cubans, that is talking to LGBTQ Cubans that are also being significantly repressed, that's having those conversations and centering those voices the loudest, not the white Cubans that were born here that have a lot of resources and a lot of money. And I know that there's a religious statement about looking at the little piece of stick in somebody else's eye before you look at the big one in your eyes. And I think that we need to live by that here in this country, here in this state. How dare we look to do more to free another country than we are willing to do the Black and brown folks right here in this state? How dare we operate with so much hypocrisy in this country?
All right. Well, that brings me to my next segment. So first and foremost, I just want to thank both of you for joining me for the show. As I told you earlier, you're both queens. I appreciate you. Thank you so much, Jasmine and Kika. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you both.
Thank you, Juwan.
You got it. You got it. And we have been talking about it. You heard Jasmine touch on it as well. Now that people are getting out into the streets here in Florida to protest for Cuban rights, eyebrows are being raised. The reason? Well, last year, Black Lives Matter protesters were out in the streets also demanding for change. And soon after, Governor DeSantis implemented an anti-riot bill. You heard about it. The bill allows an increase in law enforcement powers to crack down on civil unrest. The bill has been criticized for infringing on the First Amendment right to peacefully protest. I want you to take a listen to what he said the day he signed that bill into law. Listen. Okay, I think we have it, and maybe we don't have it. Okay, so pretty much the governor said, and we're going to try and get that soundbite here for you. The governor pretty much said, in so many words, the governor said that anyone who took to the streets could be arrested. The law specifically reads that a person may not willfully obstruct the free, convenient, and normal use of a public street, highway, or road. So with that said, so we can go and delve a little bit more into this, I want you to please welcome the anti-bill opponent, and that was Melba Pearson. Melba is an attorney and director of the American Civil Liberties Union, along with the Florida Democratic Senator Chevron Jones, who is also very outspoken on this as well. I'm going to try and get that sound bite here for you in just a moment. But first and foremost, welcome both of you to the show.
Thank you for having us, Jamal.
Thank you, Jawan. Always great to be with you.
Absolutely, Melba. And I want to start with you, Melba. You joined the show back in April before the bill was even passed, and said it was going to cause a lot of unnecessary arrests for people of color. So what do you think about the hypocrisy? You heard Jasmine talk about it, that we're seeing behind the anti-riot bill now that people are protesting for Cuban rights.
Yeah. And so that was one of the big concerns that I had when this bill was first being put forward, taking into context the discussions that were being had and the public interviews that were being given by the governor, where he was floating a very egregious, a really horrible version of this bill back last summer. And it was directly in response to the Black Lives Matter protest and the protest in support of George Floyd's family as a result of his murder by Derek Chauvin, who was a police officer. So those protests were, for the most part, peaceful. 93%, as done by a study done by Time magazine, 93% of the protests that occurred last summer were peaceful. And in Florida, he could not really point to any unrest that would have caused this bill to be needed. So this was a solution looking for a problem. And as I had mentioned back then, there were plenty of statutes. I'm a former prosecutor. If there was ever a riot that I was confronted with and needed to prosecute, before this law went into place, there were plenty of laws to be able to address these issues. So if you smashed the window of a store, that's considered, depending on the situation, burglary of a structure. That was already a felony. If you attacked a law enforcement officer, there are already minimum mandatories in place for that sort of activity. So again, none of this was needed. And so when he pointed to specifically the march that was on I-95 that closed down, part of I-95 in support of George Floyd, he specifically pointed to that as a reason for this bill. And now here we have the exact same situation. The one on I-95 was completely peaceful. The one on the Palmetto, peaceful as well. But now you have this law in place, and the folks that were protesting for Cuban rights didn't have to worry about arrest or any kind of harassment or intimidation. And to be very clear, they have every right to be able to protest, right, and raise
Absolutely.
their voices. And so I want to make that very clear. My concern is unequal treatment, because when you have unequal treatment, that is not justice.
Okay, and so let's bring in Senator Chevron Jones, because Chev, he was speaking right after that, because my phone was blowing up when this was happening. They're like, hold up, what's going on here? The hypocrisy. So Chev, you immediately went on and you said that, listen, precedent is being set here. So when there is an LGBTQ protest, when there is a BLM protest, you can't go out all of a sudden now and start arresting people because they take to the Palmetto or the block the streets or whatever have you. So you were very outspoken. Your thoughts on what the hypocrisy and everything that's been going on?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you, Jawan, for even bringing light to this situation. Yeah, and you're right about the hypocrisy from the governor and my Republican colleagues. I mean, the lawmakers, and what they have been doing is deeply disturbing, and it only increased the urgency for the people and leaders at every level to keep confronting the misinformation and the injustices to build safer and healthier communities for all of us, right? Yeah, I think Melba said it, Kika said it, and Jasmine said it. I mean, and let's be clear on one thing: that no one is out here is saying that what the Cuban people, our Cuban brothers and sisters, should not be doing. We're talking about what they should be doing. They should be raising their voices. They should be out in the street. All we're doing is discrediting HB1 and how not needed it was. Because I fully support the Cuban and the Cuban Americans who are demonstrating against the subpar living conditions in the anti-democratic authoritarian regime in Cuba. We get that. We respond to that, right? But the problem is that is it us against them type of thing? Who was HB1 created for? Because truth be told, oppression is oppression. And
right.
you can't pick when oppression voices should be raised or when they should not be raised, right? Because the voices in Cuba are just as important as the voices that are being raised here within the States when a black man or black woman is being killed by the hands of bad police officers. So, go back to what Melba just said. It's talking about equity in how we are working the law. The system has to work for all of us. We can't say that this is for some and not for others. It is important that we as a state and as the legislative branch of the state of Florida, that we are fair in how we allow people to raise their voices in their First Amendment right.
Okay, we do have that soundbite, by the way, guys, that we were trying to get to earlier. We apologize for that. So again, we want to get back to the soundbite. This is what the governor said once the bill was signed. Take a listen.
Just think about it. You're driving home from work and all of a sudden you have people out there shutting down a highway. And we worked hard to make sure that didn't happen in Florida. They start to do that. There needs to be swift penalties.
You heard it right there. There needs to be swift penalties. So Melba, I want to get back to you. So what can be done? So what happens? What happens here? I know the ACLU does have a lawsuit in place, but what happens if there is another protest? And sure enough, they take to the streets, whether it's the Palmetto, whether it's any street for that matter, they take to the streets to voice their concerns. And all of a sudden they're arrested.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very real scenario that we're looking at because of the fact that in Tampa, some folks who were out protesting in support of free Cuba ended up being arrested under this anti-protest bill. So, you have a situation where in Miami, folks were protesting. There was no arrest. You have a situation in Tampa where people were protesting. There were some arrests. Now, there may be slight differences in the facts, but at the end of the day, we're always concerned about unequal treatment. And so at present, there is a lawsuit that's been filed with the ACLU, I believe Stream Defenders, maybe League of Women Voters or Planned Parenthood, a number of different organizations, partisan and nonpartisan, who have come together to file a lawsuit saying that this law basically infringes on their First Amendment rights. And the fact of the matter is, people don't know how to plan. Right? So you may be planning a peaceful protest, right? But if you're unsure as to whether or not, listen, our path takes us down this particular street, we don't really have time to get a permit because for sure the protest that happened on the Palmetto, there was no permit because this turned around quickly. So if, groups that are now planning protests around whatever issue, whether it's, anti-abortion or pro-choice or anti-climate change or, pro-coal, whatever the case may be, everyone has an issue that's close to their heart. And you have to be able to understand what the rules are so that you can govern yourself accordingly. And by this unequal treatment, by the fact that he was making very clear statements about the protesters that were fighting for criminal justice reform last summer, blocking the highway, he allowed something completely different to happen with the Cuban folks and folks marching in solidarity with them on the Palmetto. And now you have a situation in Tampa where you have a third, scenario. That's unequal treatment. That causes people to be confused. And now you have a situation where people will choose to stay silent rather than use their First Amendment rights for fear of being arrested. And that basically almost reduces us to a lot of the things we're protesting against. So the lawsuits have already been filed. So it's two separate lawsuits. I believe that they're going to be merged at one point since all the issues are pretty much the same, even though it's different groups. And we will have a ruling probably next year with regards to the constitutionality of this law. And I think that the photos from the protests on the Palmetto, the photos and the sound bites of the governor's statement are all going to come into play in this lawsuit as we move forward.
Okay, so with that said, Senator Jones, I want to know what you plan on doing, what you and some of your colleagues plan on doing as far as the state in Tallahassee is concerned.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. No one asked for this in the first place. And I'll be clear with that. And although it won't go anywhere, I plan on filing a repeal bill for HB1. Why? Not only for the people of Cuba, it's for the people who believe in our environment, it's for the people who believe in LGBTQ rights, it's for people who believe in social justice, and it's to create a statement in the first place that it should have never been created in the first place. When you're trying to silence people and you're trying to go and say that I support the people of Cuba or the people of South Africa or wherever, and talk about authoritarian governments and all these things and telling people what they can and cannot do, you cannot say that you are in support of that, but yet still the policies that you are creating are trying to silence a group of people because you don't agree with it. So therefore, we have to raise our voices for the things we don't agree with. And so that's what I plan on doing. It will be filed as soon as possible. And Juwan, you will know about it. Again, it won't go anywhere, but I'm fine with that. But I wanted to make it clear to show the hypocrisy of what has happened, what is happening when it comes to our First Amendment right. Because there will be more scenarios when people are going to need to raise their voices. And let's be clear about something. No one, even the governor, never, not one time, when we even asked about it, when we asked about January 6th and the insurrection, when they said that that was the reason why they came with the language where they took the stand your ground language out of HB1, they didn't mention it in the press conference. He never mentions it when he speaks about it, and they never mention it in their talking points. So it's clear that HB1 was never for them. It was for us.
Amen. Amen. Well, very well said, Chaplain Jones and Melba Pearson. I want to thank both of you for joining me for this show this evening, for your insight and your thoughts. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Juwan.
You got it. And I want to thank all of you for joining me. This has been an in-depth conversation. We want to keep the conversation going. Of course, I want to thank you. You can always reach out to me. Let me know what you thought about the show. You can always reach me on Instagram at JawanNBC6 or Twitter at JawanNBC6. Let me know your thoughts about the show. Remember, it always begins with the conversation. That's how we bring folks together. Be sure to watch us also when we return back to television. We're going to be virtual until the end of the Olympics. And before we go, remember, this is what this is all about. Education is the key to success. If you believe, you will succeed. We'll see you next time. Have a great week.